Good morning, everybody. Welcome back. It's Michael Silva. Today is Sunday, May 3rd, 2020. It's 11 a.m. sharp, so we're going to go ahead and start the executive briefing on time, as we always do. These are very uncertain times, and I know a lot of us are a little bit concerned around what reintegration from the workforce back into the office means. There are several security threats. It's a bit of an unsettling time, but we see substantial opportunity in the current environment. So we'll go through a couple of areas where we see how you can leverage the current situation to your benefit, a couple of risks that we see, as well as some financial controls and considerations for growth in the third and fourth quarters of this year. So I think the most obvious thing that we're seeing is that employees are going to begin to return to work, and that's probably going to happen in the next couple of weeks. So a big consideration is how do we go about doing that? Do we have all the employees return all at once? Do we have staggered work shifts? Do we have some people permanently remote? These are kind of separate considerations from the exclusive technology portion of this, but they are still important. We've seen several organizations develop plans and actually start this in some cases, specifically around the shifted environment of having some people remote and some people on site, sharing some computers, sharing resources. But there is a unique opportunity here. And one of the things we've seen is the potential for reorganizing the teams so that you do not need to have everybody on site all at once. And what this means for many organizations is the fact that you could potentially have more of your staff on a more or less permanent work remote basis and get away with a smaller real estate footprint. So for example, if you had 10,000 square feet dedicated to a set of employees and half of them are now remote, and you can see that half of them work effectively remote, you may not need quite as much real estate on the return trip. One pretty important related note to this is you can take the opportunity to realign the way the teams communicate and work together by shuffling the deck and physically where they're sitting during this time. So before everybody shows back up to the office, you actually have a unique opportunity to think through in an ideal situation with what I've learned since maybe the last time we've moved in or the beginning of this year or last year, how could we better effectively physically position people to work together when they are back in that office? Take that into consideration along with the fact that some of the staff may be remote, and you can start to think creatively about ways that you can physically reshuffle the deck with staff. For example, one thing that you can consider is having a team operating with a work remote room, kind of like a virtual conference room. You can have an HDTV with camera that maybe certain teams share and interoperate out of, so you have a mix of both physical as well as virtual office space together in the same physical facility. I think everybody knows security is a really big deal to our organization, to me personally. And one thing that we've noticed is that threat actors have really stepped up their game in attempting to compromise organizations during this really difficult time. What specifically is being done are a set of really highly targeted phishing campaigns have been released, and threat actors are actually producing organizational charts using publicly available information from LinkedIn and other sources where they find out who reports to who, and they build a campaign based on attacking either the second or third in command, stating that the first in command is approved and asking for things like funds disbursement. It is more or less just an uptick of the standard phishing that we've seen, but it is a pretty substantial amount of phishing that's occurring, and the quality of the spam that's getting through is really, really high quality. So unfortunately, this kind of limits the technical ability to respond, and you need to complement that security portion with a training portion for the end user. What we recommend here is an ongoing security awareness training program. We think it's really, really important to involve every individual end user in the security model. We always say that the end user is the last line of defense. They're the human firewall. They are a part of the security system themselves, even though they don't view themselves that way. So we need to encourage all users to take security seriously, and even if it's something that is not convenient to them at that time, to make the time for it. So one thing we've developed is a very limited, short training program for security awareness. And if you don't have one already, you should definitely put one in place. But it is really important to make sure that employees aren't doing things that are going to put your organization at risk. So some of the unique risks that are coming up now with work remote are that tools like LogMeIn, Remote Desktop, Go to My PC, and these other types of remote connectivity tools, they work really, really well from a technical perspective, but there are unique challenges to it. So for example, people trying to print documents at home or trying to open up multiple monitors in some cases. It's just not the exact same experience as they're used to seeing when they're in the office. So what we've seen is that some folks are unfortunately copying and pasting files from the office environment down to their local computers, which of course creates a data loss risk problem. But I think more than that, it's just an information security issue where you now have data that's being distributed out to multiple different areas of the organization. Security and convenience are always on two different ends of the spectrum, right? So the most secure way to deal with this type of problem is to build out a virtual desktop environment that's highly secure, that requires two-factor authentication, that only certain people can access at certain times, and that data can't leave once they're accessing that portal. It's more or less like the jump box type model. Unfortunately, that is also one of the most expensive ways to solve the security problem. So in the short term, what we highly recommend is setting and enforcing standard policy and procedure for data security with these end users, making sure that everybody understands that their participation is critically important in keeping really key data out of the threat actor's hands so that it can't be used against them and the rest of the organization. We believe this is not going to last forever, the current virus situation. So we are planning for growth, and we see many other organizations planning for growth. Some key growth strategies where we have a unique opportunity now include documenting process for the way that certain things are being done. So we went from a very interesting place where everybody worked together, everybody kind of knew how things operated, and then everybody dispersed and left. There, in some cases, were some pretty substantial layoffs where folks were unfortunately let go as business and just the economy in general contracted. But unfortunately, right now, what we have is a situation where a lot of folks are stuck at home or they're working remote with very, very, very exclusive views into the way that certain key business processes are being completed. And they're not necessarily sharing that information. So this does create a single point of failure for that particular job role if it's not documented and shared. So one of the key tenets of growth for Q3 and Q4 is going to be making sure that your organization has a fully documented, vetted, written process for those really important business elements that are required for you to grow. In other words, if you can ask this question to yourself, like, is there any tribal knowledge that someone has within my organization that's not written down, right? If there is, then now is a fantastic opportunity to ask that individual to document it. So we always like to leave off with a couple of key considerations, things to think about over the next couple of weeks. The first most important thing is, do we really need all the real estate that we're currently leased for? The work remote environment has forced a lot of us to reevaluate the way that we're going about conducting business in the office and outside the office. And if you have now a relatively effective work remote team, then consider whether or not you actually need all the physical real estate back in the office as you reintegrate that workforce. Because here, especially in Manhattan, there are substantial cost savings to a lower real estate bill. Another question here is, have we documented the key processes for essential roles in the business? In other words, have we eliminated that tribal knowledge or have we written down ways to scale? This will be very important for Q3. Managing data security for staff's home equipment is also a pretty critically important component. We talked before about LogMeIn and data living on local machines that don't belong necessarily to the company. So you can consider how important that is to the organization. Cost savings for vendor services is also pretty important. You could think about going back and reevaluating the cost that you're spending, possibly at this point deferring some payments, maybe getting a bill reduction, or just cutting back on some unnecessary services if we haven't already done so. And just really think about what is the minimum that we need to operate here as a business to go forward. And for new hires in the inevitable growth in Q3, Q4, how are we making sure that they are properly set up? And do they have access to the right information? Do they have a secure work from home environment? And making sure that that situation, that environment is being validated by a professional to make sure that everything is the way it needs to be to have secure, stable growth in the future. Sales systems and KPIs, obviously very important. So as you define out these processes, one critical portion is sales, and understanding how you're measuring those key performance indicators for sales and other areas of the business become increasingly important as you look to growth in Q3, Q4. Do we have security awareness training? So with this now distributed environment, knowing that threat actors are ramping up their game with aggressive phishing attacks, are we also simultaneously educating our staff, making sure that they're aware of what's going on and they're preparing themselves, or are we just sitting vulnerable as these attacks increase? Security is going to become a much bigger concern in Q3, Q4, although it's particularly important now. And e-commerce capability. So when we talk normally about e-commerce, we would say, do we have a storefront, right? But here I'm talking more about the overall e-commerce capability of the business as a whole. Do you have the ability for a customer to go through the entire purchase lifecycle, the support lifecycle remotely, or is there still some component, maybe even a back-end component, where someone needs to be physically on site for that? These are questions that you need to think through now, because having a remote distributed workforce, enabling the sales team to deliver on those orders, whether it's service or product, is going to be key to growth as well. And the last question here is, do we have a central repository for information? So again, this goes back to making sure that everything that's important to grow the business is documented. I'm a big fan of checklists. I'm a big fan of process and procedure. And I think that those process and procedures are going to get modified. They're going to change over time. But as the business continues to grow, do you have the instrumentation? Do you have the platform ready to be able to have new staff onboarded to operate in lockstep with existing staff, and also provide the KPIs you're going to need to be able to measure that performance? So that's it. We keep it brief today. There's a lot more on the table, but this is an executive briefing, so this is the high-level items. Hope this has been very helpful for you guys. We will go ahead and take some questions and answers now, and this recording, of course, yes, will be published live.